Hello and welcome to our third episode of Geopolitics with Swasti with our consulting editor and foreign policy expert, Swasti Rao. So this has been a big week for geopolitics. There's been a ripple effect across the world because of what's happening with Trump 2.0 in America, and we'll dig into some of that. I know some of you might have missed our episode yesterday, but it was a really busy news day. From next week, we'll be back to regular programming with Geopolitics with Swasti every Saturday, so please do tune in. Okay, so let's dive right in. Our first question is from @Sanchit Suman 4907, who asks about the normalization of India and China's ties after Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri's recent visit to China. He says that the Chinese demand to step back from US engagement seems like they might be negotiating from a position of strength and superiority. How do you see this progressing? And does India have any strategic leverage when it comes to dealing with China?
So very quickly, I think it all depends on the way you're looking at it. First of all, the normalization and the value of that. I think it's a good question. This normalization that you see, I mean, finally unfolding as Vikram Misri has gone to China, did not really start there. It basically started in October. If you remember, October 2024 was a fairly important month for India-China relations, especially on the LAC, because that was when, on the 21st of October, when Vikram Misri, first said and kind of surprised everybody that India and China have reached a disengagement agreement along the LAC. And, this, of course, we've been negotiating for many years because you know what happened in Galwan 2020. Now, cutting a long story short, this was the statements that Vikram Misri gave on the 21st of October were further, in many ways confirmed or reconfirmed by Dr. Jaishankar the same day. He was speaking at a summit and he said that yes, India and China have reached a kind of agreement. And in fact, because it was so early that one did not know what sense to make of it, because from India's perspective, it looked as if we have now gone back to the status quo ante. But then slowly we kind of realized that all this was basically the hard work that was put into trying, basically to enable President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi to meet, because they were going to be meeting for the BRICS summit in Kazan. And this was going to be their first meeting on the sidelines of the BRICS meeting, the first meeting in 5 years. And then very quickly, then you saw that on 23rd, these two leaders met and they kind of hailed the tactical disengagement. Now, very quickly, there are some problems. There is not normalization. The problem between India and China when it comes to the LAC is structural. So if there has to be any real normalization, it has to be structural, right? It cannot happen with a tactical disengagement because that disengagement is not followed by de-escalation. So the number of troops that both sides have deployed remain the same. Not just that, in the last 4 or 5 years, China has also massively doubled down on a lot of infrastructure modernization in those regions. And that kind of, somewhere urges India to never let its guard down. So I have always said that this tactical disengagement is a tactical step forward, but should definitely be taken with a lot of strategic, I would say, realism, rather than any, too much of hope, because what history has taught us that China cannot really be trusted. So that's very quickly about the disengagement. It's very tactical. The second thing is that, when you say that does India have any strategic leverage over China, the fact of the matter is that India does not have strategic leverage over China, because pick up anything, trade, 120 billion worth of trade, and out of that, more than 100 billion remains in our trade deficit. When we export more to the West, so whether it's the US, whether it's the EU, whether it's the UK, when we are exporting more to the West, and those are the relationships where we have, a trade surplus, in order to, export more to the West, we have to import more from China because our dependence on China for all the raw materials and the API, etc., continues. So do we have a strategic leverage in trade? No. Secondly, do we have a strategic leverage over China in our neighborhood? Absolutely not. That's been one of the reasons why India has been trying to redo and refocus on its neighborhood, because we do see that today in India, apart from Bhutan, perhaps, There is
We're
no
looking
other
at the
country
yeah.
that has not signed a BRI with China. I mean, look at what happened just now with Maldives. First, it took money from us, and then it went ahead with its plans with China. So there is an encircling. I mean, there is no doubt about that, and we have to be careful of that. So, do we have a strategic leverage? No, we don't.
No.
Then, thirdly, we used to have some strategic leverage over China through our relationship and friendly relationship and time-tested relationship with Russia. But because of the Russia-Ukraine war and the kind of strategic, I would say, readjustment
Recalculation,
and
yeah.
recalibration of those ties there. I frankly do not think that we have the same room to maneuver when it comes to having a leverage. Perhaps we would definitely keep engaging Russia because of our own reasons. But is there a reason? Is China leverage? I mean, creating a strategic leverage over China. I don't think it really operates in the same way as it did in the pre-Ukraine war
Right.
era. So I think because of all these, look at for example military. I have through the worldview and through many other platforms. I have again and again argued that even in military terms, we do not have a leverage over China. I mean, in every single numerical, so to say, marker of any military capability, China outpaces India. Whether it's the maritime domain, whether it's the continental domain, whether it's the space, the rocket force, whatever it is. Very quickly, where I do see some light at the end of the tunnel is that China is not interested in an all-out war against India.
Yeah.
Okay, China would perhaps continue with salami slicing and those kind of tactics, but China is not really interested in an all-out war because its focus is there on Taiwan, and that is also a reason coming back and now bringing it to Trump, that because under Trump, Trump has been giving such mixed signals, not only to its adversaries but also its allies. In
Yeah.
fact, that kind of strategic confusion that
Yeah.
Trump has kind of perpetuated the world over has been a matter of concern for everybody.
Everyone, yeah.
And I think it is there that China is trying to somewhere lessen this bonhomie between India and the US, which has been growing, of course, in the last many years. But I frankly do not think that is going to happen. Even then, I think it is in India's interest to manage China right now. And what all you see with respect to Vikram Misri going there or the tactical disengagement is basically a reflection of that understanding that it is in India's interest to manage its relationship with China because of all these dependencies, as well as a very, very fluid world order where actually nobody knows
Who's going to come out on
who's going to
top?
come out of, yeah.
So we have another question from a member of ThePrint at Paulaws007 who asks, has not talking to Pakistan outlived its utility?
For India.
Yeah, for India.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, in a Shakespearean way, it's like to talk or not to talk, right? But I do understand that where this is coming from, because this is the popular sentiment that Pakistan doesn't need, talking. We need to let the guns do the talking with Pakistan, because every time history has shown us, whenever we've tried to talk to Pakistan, we probably got a Kargil, we probably got an attack on our parliament, and we probably got a 26/11. So, what do you speak to Pakistan about, right? But despite that, let me just try to put that a little bit into perspective. I think this is not just reflected by the common sentiment, but this is also somewhere reflected by the top leadership. So Ajay Bisaria, who was India's High Commissioner to Pakistan, he wrote his memoirs, and in his memoirs, he actually mentions how Prime Minister Modi chose a communication. I mean, he had a communication strategy towards Pakistan, which was silence. And when during Balakot strikes, when Imran Khan tried to call Prime Minister Modi during midnight or late at night, he actually did not take the call. And the point was that there's nothing to talk, frankly. So cutting a long story short, I think history has shown us that there is a limitation to how much you can talk to Pakistan. India has always maintained, whether it's on the question of Kashmir, and India also snubbed, for example, Nawaz Sharif's pleas for negotiation, and India said that there's nothing to talk because it was an internal matter and we've resolved it. So I do understand that talking in terms of trying to put a posture that we are wanting to accommodate what Pakistan has to say, I don't think that is going to work, because from India's perspective, I told you, all these repeated attacks, but not just that, no amount of talking to Pakistan is going to really solve Pakistan's obsession on Kashmir, Pakistan's obsession to sort of undermine India's regional aspirations, global aspirations. So Pakistan will continue doing that. I don't think we can really get into that. But what you really have to understand is that even though mainstreaming that channel is not what the Indian government looks at. But covert channels or back
Right.
channels discussions are always on.
Yeah.
Even at the height of Cold War, you would know that both the adversaries were speaking to each other. So the covert channels will be there. I think something which is much more, important for us to look at is that today it's not about Pakistan. It is about a Pakistan that is propped up and backed by China, and a Pakistan that is also now trying to forge a very new enthusiastic relationship with Bangladesh after what
Bangladesh.
has happened
Yeah.
in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
So I think one needs to understand that that minimum engagement has to continue, not with Pakistan, but for the sake of sort of balancing and countering
The
all these
region.
initiatives, okay, in our neighborhood. Also understand, look at SCO, for example, Vandana. I mean, the reason why SCO doesn't work for India, SCO is the Shanghai Cooperation
Yeah.
Organization, doesn't work for India, and it's anti-terrorist, the structure, they have RATS, regional anti-terrorist structure, doesn't work for India because there's Pakistan in it. Okay, SARC has not been able to work because there's
Take off in the
Pakistan
same
in
way.
it.
Yeah.
Similarly, in the last episode, we discussed about TAPI, the gas
Yeah.
pipeline.
Yeah.
I mean, from India's perspective, we don't want a pipeline which is coming to us from Pakistan, and Pakistan can weaponize that sort of energy dependence, etc. So what I'm saying is that India has to be careful. I mean, India still has to be in these organizations because, like I said, it is to balancing the presence of Pakistan, the actions of Pakistan. But India also needs to be very careful. For example, in the last year, there were certain reports that said that China is trying to push for Pakistan's inclusion in BRICS. Now, that is something which is absolutely against India's interest. And if India were to walk away from BRICS, India would never be able
Yeah.
to, balance that. So, cutting a long story short, I think what I want to, focus on is that mainstreaming that position of a dialogue is not going to solve our problems with Pakistan. We have tried doing that in the past, and it has not yielded results. But at the same time, the covert channels are almost always operating, even though if they are not in the public domain. And thirdly, we don't need to speak to Pakistan, but we need to speak to others to balance this, asymmetry that India finds itself into, especially when it comes to the neighborhood because of China and Bangladesh and Turkey and so on and so forth.
There's a song when you say a lot when you say nothing at all. Yeah, so I'm actually clubbing a few questions here, Swasti, from our members at AnuTube2360 and at Ravi89Rules. They're asking if the delay in the delivery of the GE404 engines is an issue that will be raised during Modi's upcoming visit to the White House, which is scheduled for next week. And also, what else can we expect from this visit? I mean, there's been a lot, like we were just talking about it, there's been a lot that's been said about India's bonhomie with the US. So
Which
what
is
can
in
we
trouble,
expect?
frankly, with Trump. Yeah.
No, tell us.
Yeah, so very quickly, see, you have to understand something that when it comes to the GE404 engines, let me just explain to you why we need the GE404. So there are two things. There is a GE404 and then there is a GE414. Okay. Right now, we are looking at the General Electric in the US for the GE404. That decision has already been taken. The money has been, already paid.
Sanctioned, yeah.
It is more than, I think, 5,000 crores worth of, money. What has happened is that it is a victim of overpromise. Okay. So we signed it many years ago. We are still awaiting it. And I think as per the latest reports that came out, I think only yesterday, we are now hearing that the GE are going to be delivering those first batch of engines in March 2025. I personally don't think that that deadline could also be missed. By the way, India has also put penalties on GE for all this delay. So very quickly, the thing that you have to understand is that it is not because of the American deep state trying to destabilize India that has come in the way of the GE404 deliveries. It's simply logistics and supply chain issues because the GE does not have the capabilities to manufacture as much as they promised. And that's why I said that this is a victim of overpromise. Okay. But it's not the GE404. It's also the GE4, and we need the GE404 for our Tejas Mark 1.
Yeah.
Okay. But then there is also something called the Tejas Mark 2. And for that, as well as for the AMCAs, we are looking at the GE414, which is a more advanced version of the same engine. Now, very quickly, ask yourself this question: why would America or the American deep state, which is extremely transactionalist under Donald Trump, would try to sabotage their own rosy roti? Because if these deals come through, I mean, half of them have already been decided. This is going to get America in many ways their rosy roti from India for the next 15, 20 years, right? And we are not talking about a couple of engines here or there. We are talking about engines for more than 600, 700 aircraft, because they just Mark 1, they just Mark 2. And the arm cast, this is immense. And by the way, I don't know if a lot of people there, I mean, and the viewers know that the GE also delivers a lot of commercial engines for commercial planes to India. So long story short, I mean, it is absolutely in America's interest to try and push for it and try to expedite it, which is not happening because of political reasons. It is happening because there is just so much strain on the global supply chains. And the demand, of course, the world is militarizing. So the entire world is looking at these engines.
And what else can we expect? What are you looking forward to from the visit to the White House next week?
Like I said, Donald Trump is not only transactionalist. If he were transactionalist, then it becomes very easy to predict what he's doing, right? Because transactionalism is extremely rational. But then when it is also layered with so much unpredictability, then it becomes difficult to see what is going to happen. But like I said, that the first thing would be that India is going to give in to a lot of American demands. And similarly, we would try, and also lowering of tariffs. India has already agreed to that. So this is for the trade surplus. But I recommend that you also go back to the first and second episodes, because for the other viewers, it's like a repetition of those questions. So,
and make sure you tune in next week when we'll be discussing what happened.
Yes, when he's there.
So we have another question from at Ravi89 Rules on the Rafale deal. And he asks, considering the precarious situation of the Indian Air Force's future, why isn't India just buying more Rafale aircrafts from France? And I have a second part of that question, but I'll ask you after you tell us.
So about the Rafales, right? See, you please understand that India has bought, right? India has bought about 36 Rafales from France already. And now we're talking about Rafale Marines, which are for the Indian Navy. Now, very quickly, this number 36 was not something that the Air Force had proposed, because the Air Force in the year 2000, 2001 or 2, around that time, had given an assessment and given a requirement to the MOD and to the government, saying that they need 126 MMRCA, which is modern multi-role aircraft. It's a combat aircraft. But then only 36 came. So first of all, you have to understand what happened. So back then, when this deal was, was being pushed, it was very simple. The Air Force told the MOD that we need 126 fighters, and the MOD then got it cleared. The Ministry of Finance also said that, all right, we register that you need this, this number, and for that we are going to make sure that the funds are made available. But then, what happened was that a tender was floated. Of course, there were 5 aircrafts that competed for it, and then 2, and our own Indian test pilots actually flew them in all those different conditions, and then 2 were shortlisted, Rafales and the Eurofighter Typhoons. And then the Air Force said that fine, it is the government that has to take the call, and the government, in consultation with the Indian Air Force, then actually went for the Rafales. So on and so forth. And then once that was done, then a CNC was formed. What is CNC? CNC is a cost negotiating committee. Okay, and it is through the CNC then the cost is negotiated with what is the cost of the aircraft, what is the supplemental package, which covers things like spares, things like maintenance and all of that. So what was agreed upon is that 24 of these jets are going to come from France, but the rest of them are going to be built in India by HAL. Now, this particular deal, which was early 2000s, kind of fell into problems because of 2 reasons. One reason was that Rafale, basically Dassault Aviation, said that we are not going to give guarantees for the aircraft that you are going to be making in India by HAL. We are only going to be giving you guarantees for the ones that we make in France. That's the first problem. The second problem was, which was a minor problem but a bigger problem for India, that a part of that was actually given to Anil Ambani back in the day, and that became a controversial thing. So long story short, because of these 2 problems, and because there were a lot of I would say back and forth on these, then more than a decade passed, and then finally the government of the day took the decision that the squadron strength is depleting in more than this one decade that had followed after this particular deal failing to go through. Then by then we had also lost more aircraft because of accidents and phasing out, etc. And then the government of the day actually went ahead through a G2G mechanism and got the 36 Rafales. Now it doesn't mean that the Air Force said that we only needed 36. The Air Force said that we need 126 and we still need some more. Now, very quickly, what happens is now in this background, if you ask this question, should then India right now, when the Air Force squadron strength is critically low, go for more Rafales or go for others? See, what you have to understand is that it does make sense for India to go for more Rafales, especially because of the reason that, it's not just about the cost of the aircraft. Cost of the aircraft is one factor. There's also cost of the spare parts and cost of maintenance. Then there's also cost of the infrastructure that you develop to actually create those hangars and weapons bays, etc.
Right.
When you look at India's investments for Rafales, when you say, oh, Rafales are very expensive, but please understand that at Ambala and Hashimara, we have these other facilities. And currently, at its current stage, if you were to look at the Air Force assessment, you will see that they already have the capacity to absorb another 100 aircraft from the soy aviation, because they have other things being equal, right? Now, if you were to go for new ones, you will have to train pilots for it, whether it's an F-16 or an F-35 or it's a Su-57 or whatever that may be, or a Eurofighter Typhoon, etc. So that is what one needs to understand, and why is it the Air Force is pushing, or the government is pushing for Rafales? Because even though the Rafales remain expensive, if you were to break that cost down to all these factors about, spare parts, maintenance, infrastructure development, weapons bay, replenishment, seats, engines, all of that, training of crew, training of pilots, all of that will tell you that it makes sense, because it's better economies of scale, which you don't see now because, of course, the cost is so huge. But those are the reasons why the government it finds it justified to actually push for Rafales right now, and especially since India is not able to make its own LCA Mark 1 and the AMCAs. So right now, to fill that gap, Rafale seem to be the best contender because of the prevailing reasons I just told you about.
Yeah. And this was the additional question from one of our members at Anu2360, who asks, India seems to be bending backwards to accommodate the US president's demands. Till what level do you think the Modi government will give in before saying no to certain things?
Well, I think this is a rather extreme way of putting it, that Modi government will, of course, the India is going to fold because of India's interests, frankly. India is not doing it to serve US interests. India is doing that to serve India's interests. That's the first thing. And how far and no further? If you really want to sort of word it like that, I think India is not going to accept, for example, if Trump were to invite India to join the NATO, I don't see that happening. Or if Trump would ask India to leave the BRICS or the, those kind of organizations. Because in one of the episodes, I also explained in great detail how actually the West also benefits by letting India stay here. Because if India were to go or India were to leave, then these organizations run the risk of becoming completely anti-Western, which is not in the West's interest either. So I do see that there are limits to it. And please remember that when you say giving in, it's not giving in for American interest. I think that's a very important point to remember, that India must operate in India's national interest.
And does.
And because US is an important strategic partner for India, that is why you see all the recent flexibility and resilience that you see in the Indian side.
You just mentioned AMCAs, which are Advanced Medium Combat Aircrafts. The second part of this question was, do you support the call from some analysts to move AMCA development directly under the supervision of the PMO, in the same way that space and atomic energy?
Now, very quickly, this is a hypothetical question, and if you really were to understand it from the Air Force's perspective, I think they don't have a problem. Why not? If the PMO, they basically want the procurement channels to be effective and to be efficient, smoother. So yes, you could do it, under the PMO, or you could also set up a dedicated agency, right? And by the way, I think here, if we are just talking about examples, even though we keep sort of criticizing Pakistan for everything. But let's not forget, Vandana, that Pakistan did have something called Strategic Plans Division, which is SPD, which was actually put together to ensure this kind of
Okay.
efficiency and this kind of smoothness. And right now it has headquarters in Rawalpindi, but it is a useful model to study because it did, because of these procurement bottlenecks. See, end of the day, India and Pakistan come from the same cultural milieu, the
Right.
same sort of procrastination milieu, perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think Pakistan, to some extent, put this, raised this issue, and then the SPD was Pakistan Strategic Plans Division was made, and this is not to just to tell you that this remains a model, but this is an example, right? That India could also try and make a
Emulate.
dedicated body where these bottlenecks can be, and of course make it empowered enough to sort of solve these bottlenecks, etc. And of course, why not? Why not? Yeah.
So our last question for today's episode is from @Navneet Rohila 007. Should India join the G7?
Oh, the G7, the group of seven, right? Vandana, there are so many groups. There's a G7. Earlier, this was G8. There's a
Yeah.
G20. There's a
Yeah.
G77. So, just to declutter, G7 is a group of world's advanced industries. Okay, so it has your usual suspects. Of course, it has the USA, it has UK, it has France, it has Italy, it has Germany, it has Canada and Japan. Okay. Now, this G7 was formed in 1975. It has a very, very Cold War context. Okay. And of course, the question is not on how the G7 was formed, but if I want to tell you why India is not a formal member, I have to just tell you where this is coming from. So, very quickly, so this G7 was formed in 1975 to basically adapt and coordinate policies because of what the OPEC countries decided to do, when it came the oil producing countries. So, it has that background. And this G7 from 1998 to about 2014, Russia was also part of the G7, and then it was referred to as G8. And Russia's membership was cancelled, revoked because of Russia's actions in Crimea in 2014. And ever since, it's the G7, G8 became G7. Now, very quickly, what has happened is that the G7 is the European Union, by the way, is also a non-numerated member, which means that it doesn't change G7 to G8 or G9, but it's there, and it is
with
always
France, Italy, and Germany.
Correct. Yeah. So basically, you have to somewhere remember that the G7 and the formation of it has a very, very Cold War context. Okay, that's one. The other thing is that India is not a formal member, but in the last few years, I'd say by now India is already invited to the grouping. I think about 11 times, if not 12 times, and by Prime Minister Modi alone, for Prime Minister Modi alone, I think it's been 5 times that he has been invited. So what you do see is that there's a pattern, and I think that's the intent of your question, that you do see that India has been getting invited to G7 meetings because of many reasons. First of all, you have to understand that G7, there is a realization that the G7 cannot really function well if there is nobody to take into account the economic policies of the other developing countries, especially the emerging markets. Okay, and because China and Russia both are not members of the G7, then please understand the value of India. India's GDP today is more than some of the G7 members. India's GDP is close to about $4 trillion, which is more than the GDP of Canada, more than the GDP of France or the UK. Then also see, India has a 2+2 mechanism with so many of its members, like for example, with the UK, with US, with Japan, France, it has excellent ties. Then India's importance in the Indo-Pacific cannot be overstated. So, and the Indo-Pacific and the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific, the sea lanes of communication in the Indo-Pacific remain so crucial for world trade and the resilience of supply chains. So, if G7 is a group of advanced economies, those economies cannot really ensure that their economic well-being if the Indo-Pacific dynamic is not taken into account. And there India is it is an indispensable partner.
They can't afford to ignore India.
So because of all these reasons, you do see that the G7 countries have been repeatedly inviting India to its summits. But despite that, India has never received a formal invitation to join, So There is a case for it. There is a strong case for it. If there is a formal invitation, whether India will join or not also remains to be seen, because India would not like to be clubbed in a grouping which perhaps has extremely Cold War era,
And which
overtones and
isolates a
undertones,
lot of,
etc. And
yeah.
India is wary of that. But that's still speculation. The fact of the matter is that don't assume that India has been formally invited to join the G7. I don't think that has really happened. But there is a strong case, and India, you will see more and more, number of times that India is invited to the. And it's not just India, by the way. If you pick up any G7 summit, you will see that not just India, but Argentina, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, all these countries are invited. Not just that, different kind of organizations such as the World Bank, IMF, those institutions are also represented there. So yes, you can see that at an informal level, there is a lot of effort to try and make the G7 more inclusive, because the global economy and the resilience of supply chains and friendshoring and all those things basically demand a more inclusive structure. But having said that, whether there is a formal invite on the table for India, I don't think so.
Well, on that note, I think we'll end today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us, Swasti, and thank you so much for watching. And please do tune in next